Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We're definitely a global community over here. I'm going to give it a few more seconds and then we'll get started because we have quite the agenda today. All right, let's get started. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us. And also for participating in Global Week. We're big fans, and we hope you catch some of their other measurement events as well. So my name is Yakuta Fatehi, and I work at the William Davidson Institute at the University of Michigan. We are a practice-oriented research institute that focuses on finding solutions to tricky challenges for businesses in the Global South. And I encourage you to check out our website. I specifically work with companies on complex measurement, gender, and strategy projects. I'll keep my introduction really short because we have quite a bit to cover today. So we are all gathered here to discuss how research can unlock innovation for accelerators and incubator programs. So this is how we structured today's webinar. We'll discuss two questions. The first one, of course, focus on the title of this webinar. And the second one, we'll discuss how we aim to decolonize research. So I'll explain what that means when I get to that second question. So the way we've set up today's call is we'll spend about 30 minutes on the first question on research, 20 minutes on the second one on decolonization, and about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. So without further ado, let's get started with this first question. I request my panelists, beginning with Nick, then Stephen. I'll pop in for a little bit as well, and then Jonathan to briefly introduce themselves and then get into their materials. So Nick, please open with IKEA Foundation's approach to how evidence-based stage-gated grant making unlocks innovations for accelerators like KCIC, which is one of your grantees.
Thank you, Yakuta. Hello, everyone. I'm an MEL manager with IKEA Foundation based in Leiden, the Netherlands. We are a grant-making organization across 6 portfolios. I represent our portfolio that works on employment and entrepreneurship, obviously giving the topic of this session. We make about 25 grants in this portfolio currently, and we make new grants annually of about 50 million euros. So today, our portfolio of employment and entrepreneurship grants stands at about 95 million euros. So several of the partners we fund work in the space of incubation, acceleration, business management training. And we are very interested as a funder to fund the right things, obviously. And we know the evidence out there is that business management training works to some extent in some contexts for some types of businesses to improve business performance. We know accelerators may work, but we never know quite exactly, is it the funding that goes with an accelerator or an incubator that makes it work? Is it the content or the quality of the formal business management training? Or is it all the interactions of the mentors and counselors that go with these models? So we want to know. And to do that, we use an approach called stage gating to our grant making. And we fund and do an impact evaluation or impact research for certain grants at certain moments. And this is what I'd like to talk about, how we approach that. What does it do for us, this stage gating approach? Essentially, from an investor like ourselves perspective, there's always uncertainty when you make grants. You're trying to solve compelling and complex problems, and there's high levels of uncertainty whether interventions are going to work in certain contexts, whether the quality will be good enough, whether external context variables are going to intervene. So we want to reduce our uncertainty when we make a grant. And this is stage gating for us. At the same time, stage gating can help us decide how big a grant should be, how we should design it, what is the actual evidence that is there that makes us make a confident decision on the allocation. And then going forward, after a grant has been made, we use stage gating to decide what are we going to do for going forward? What is the evidence that came out? How have enterprises benefited? How have accelerator or incubator models been able to innovate and improve, of course, the performance of their business clients? And some of these decisions could be redo a grant, learn more, or could be about scaling. And this brings me to our next slide. So you can think of this as a little graph where on one axis you see uncertainty about whether a certain grant is going to work or a model will be effective. And the other axis is time. And then essentially what we try to do is we try to reduce uncertainty about the evidence, about the effectiveness, about the quality of a grant across time by starting, for example, with stage 1, which is a scoping grant. And this is very similar to product development in IT or in other parts of our economy. But we try to scope first, for example. And in the case of our partner KCIC, who's on this call as well in this webinar, we started with a smaller grant that just tried to test, to generate some evidence on the incubator and accelerator approach of KCIC in Kenya with a limited number of green businesses at the time. And then once that was over, we had a look at, okay, there's evidence, there's monitoring data coming in, we see CO2 reductions being measured, we see employment being generated in some of these businesses, and we see the original investment, the grant or the loan being returned to KCIC. So then we have a discussion with KCIC and with Stephen and his colleagues. Okay, what's next? How shall we stage 2 this grant? And then we extend the period, we add resources on our side, but we also have a very good discussion with Stephen and his team. How would we generate more evidence that actually more rigorously tests the theory of change of this stage 2 grant? So we'd be testing essentially and sort of reducing the uncertainty that is still part of any grant in any complex environment. And then we design a new grant together that builds in an impact evaluation or research into the effectiveness of the model. And what I'll say for the second part of our webinar, we don't do that very top down as a funder. We have a lot of space in discussing with the partner if they want to hire their own learning partner, if they're capable and interested in doing it themselves, if they would like IKEA Foundation to fund this research. So that's a discussion we have. At some stage, you move to scaling, perhaps, and actually a stage 3, where you're pretty certain that your theory of change works. You've got rigorous evidence coming out of an impact evaluation, and you're interested in seeing, can we do with perhaps the same level of resources or less, the same or more in terms of scaling. So have other parts of the ecosystem take over the approach, support it with euros, so that we can scale the intervention and invite others to replicate it, because there is solid evidence on it, that it works and that you might be able to scale it. And then at some stage, and I have to be modest here, in our portfolio, we only have 2 partnerships that are at this stage 4, which is about transforming, or I think more appropriately, systems being changed through your grant making. And there, essentially, you don't need philanthropic capital or donor funding anymore to prove an intervention or to reach a certain scale. But you'll see that the market or the public sector or just other organizations take over the intervention, maybe even improve it more, and then you'll have actually started to solve your theory of change. So that's rather ambitious. Now, these 4 stages are they're not there as an example. In certain contexts, we might add a stage 0, which is just a study, preceding the scoping, or you may redo a stage 3 or a stage 2. But it just helps us reduce the risk, because there's evidence, and this takes me to my next slide. Thank you, Yakuta. Yeah. So there's evidence requirements that come out of these various stages that reduce your risk as a grantor going forward. So stage 1, after scoping, you'll have a solution that's ready to be tried. you've got your data collected to understand how those individuals or businesses that are being targeted are being affected. So you have a good reality check on your theory of change. So that's sort of the end evidence that makes for us ready to say, okay, let's go to stage 2 of the piloting and testing. We can roll it out a little bit to a larger area and population, and the data would just indicate short-term results are very promising. And this is, of course, where we're at now with KCIC. We want to have an evaluation that measures effectiveness conducted by an external party with sufficient rigor. Once that is there, you move on to a stage 3 of scaling. And all of the evidence you need there is about that the intervention has been proven to be effective and is ready to be implemented at scale. At times, we still have elements of a stage 2. If, for example, in the case also of KCIC, we move to new populations in other parts of the country, for example, or slightly different context is targeted because it's particularly around solid waste management businesses. That's slightly different. So there's some changes there. I think important here, if going to stage 4, so the transformation stage, is that actually you can scale and replicate in a manner that affects the system as a whole. And this you could say to be, for example, in the case of KCIC, the ecosystem around solid waste management in the country. We're not there yet, but we hope to get there and move across the stages. And I think I'm a little quick, but I'll hand over to Stephen and Yakuta now to explain more in detail of the project, but also, of course, of the impact evaluation design that WDI and KCIC have worked on together. Thank you for now.
Thank you so much, Nick. Stephen?
Yeah, good afternoon, good morning all. It's a pleasure to be here. And my name is Stephen Musyoka. I'm the Monitoring and Evaluation Manager at Kenya Climate Innovation Center. And Kenya Climate Innovation Center was formed around 12 years ago as an initiative of the World Bank to be able to spearhead the role of the private sector in climate change mitigation and adaptation in Kenya. And basically, our approach is hinged on incubation and acceleration of early stage companies and growth stage companies that are within 5 thematic areas that we considered, or after the research was done during the formation, they were deemed to be most crucial in safeguarding or in cushioning the country against the effects of climate change. And these thematic areas are around renewable energy, agriculture, waste management, commercial forestry, and the water sector. So for us, our approach is to be able to identify early stage companies. These are basically innovations that are coming from those particular set of thematic areas, and provide technical advisory and also some sort of financing as a means to catalyze their growth, and also ensure that these businesses are able to commercialize and at the end of the day also remain sustainable in their growth. So for us, we have been doing this for the last 12 years. So far, we have created and generated sufficient evidence to say that our model is working. And recently, under the IKEA program, we developed a program around the waste management sector, which also happened to be our thematic area, in a bid just to create some sort of formality in that particular sector, and also as a means of just meeting the objectives of job creation by the enterprises. And we at the formation of the program, we also got into contact with the WDI, who became our learning partner. And our purpose for us, and their particular purpose for them, is to help us in the design of a research methodology that will be able to just ensure that the impact side of the program is well coordinated. We wanted them and to use their experience just to highlight the kind of impact we are seeing from that particular sector, and how can this be used further for program improvement and also for the ecosystem. As you all know that the waste management sometimes can be a little bit informal. So our particular approach is to see how do we create tangible evidence around the business model that you are using at KCIC. How do we test our theory of change to see if it holds? And at the end of the day, how do we also contribute to the ecosystem by providing lessons and learnings that can be used just to enrich the ecosystem, and also see how more private investors and also others interested parties can be able to join into this particular sector. So I'm excited about this webinar, and I look forward to an in-depth discussion. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So what I want to focus on is a little bit on the technical content. So, you know, while Stephen's focused on the goals, I'll take you a little bit through the process, as well as I want to touch also in a more general manner, so that if there are any entrepreneurs in the room today, you can take away these principles and frameworks and think about how these can be applied to your own measurement and learning strategies. So I have a few slides, and I won't be able to cover all of them because there's a lot of content on them. But what I will do is when we send you the recording of this webinar, I'll include the slides as well, and then please follow up with me by email if you have any questions on the content. So on this first slide, what I've highlighted is that typically measurement is only thought of as a reporting or accountability requirement for funders. And yes, it is that, but it is also so much more. And this is where you can unlock innovation, right? This is the question that we're all wondering today is, how can research do more? So first off, I would suggest think about creating targeted research questions about your design. So for example, are you having a strategy issue? Are you having an implementation or operational issue? So beyond just testing on your theory of change or testing about the impact that your program is having, maybe consider research questions that are focused more on your strategy or your operational challenge that you're facing. Another way to use research is actually to use continuous improvement or lean thinking methodologies and tools. And so here your research is actually focused on where is there waste in our processes, why is there waste in their processes, and then how can we actually eliminate it. Another way to use research is actually to focus on what are your stakeholder needs, and then through that exercise, identify and co-create solutions with them. And here, I'll get on the next slide into how do you implement that kind of exercises with stakeholders. And then, of course, you can also use research to conduct return on investment calculations so that it helps you with your decision-making on whether you want to continue a particular strategy or not, right? And whether this is a shorter-term strategy or a longer-term strategy. And especially when you are thinking about, okay, do I want to embed gender into my operations as an early-stage company? If you are, focused on having gender in your DNA, what is the return on investment on that? Does it make business sense? And so we have examples of all of that on our website. So again, I'd encourage you to go on the website. So those are the other different ways that you can use research to unlock innovations beyond just typical measurement of your theory of change. Now, on this next slide that I have over here, I want to operationalize some of what I just shared, right? So often, and this is very much true for resource-constrained early startups, you are trying to extend your buck for the biggest bang, right? So what I typically do is I actually refer folks to Acumen Academy. They have this excellent free class on lean data. And then I also recommend MIT's D-Labs 4Rs. That's the lean research framework. And I'll drop all those links in a moment. But I also want to highlight that often you do need to understand why changes are happening, and sometimes numbers don't tell you the why behind it. So I also work with our partners to develop qualitative questions and include mixed method research into what we're doing with them, right? So and then moving on, when you work with stakeholders, right, as I was saying, how do you actually operationalize that? So working with stakeholders, you have to think about, okay, who are the right people that we need in the room? What are the power imbalances? How do we apply a gender lens, which at the minimum means that, are you collecting data from women as well? And are you considering how do you reach the women? Because often the men can be the gatekeepers of information. And are you doing, at a minimum, a sex disaggregated analysis? There are also other lenses that you could apply, like equity lenses, transformational change lenses, participatory lenses. And so there's a lot of content online, and these are the various ways that you can think about how to engage with your stakeholders. Now, moving on, I want to talk specifically about this KCIC project. This, as Stephen mentioned, this is the SWIFT program. And so far, what we've done is we've collected the baseline on the first cohort. So how this program is structured is that there are companies that are going to get the acceleration and incubation services, and they've been broken up into two cohorts. Cohort 1 in 2024, and there's a cohort 2 in 2025. So we've conducted the baseline for the first cohort. And this is a quasi-experimental research study, so there is a comparison group, which means there are companies that are representative of the treatment group. And so what we've done together with KCIC from the very get-go, when we started this program back in November, is focus on how do we co-develop an impact measurement plan with our partners, and identify, okay, who are the various partners? Of course, you would think it's KCIC, but when you're developing a theory of change, who else should be involved, right? And so that was the process we actually kicked off our research design with, was how do we develop and enhance the theory of change that KCIC had put together during that proposal stage with IKEA Foundation? How do we enhance that by taking into account what entrepreneurs themselves want? So we actually spoke to 3 entrepreneurs. Again, everything is push and pull, right, with the resources that you have available. So we spoke to entrepreneurs, we talked to senior management at KCIC. Now, what a theory of change allows you to do is see all the different actors, right, that are involved in this particular project and can create change. So in fact, KCIC is also working with county government, and that's one spot actually we did not have the resources to include in our theory of change. So there will always, again, be that push and pull between the resources you have and developing and using best practices in theory of change co-development, right? Now, I want to take a step back in case theory of change is a new concept or a new tool to you. This is basically just an impact pathway, or in business lingo, it's a strategy map of how change occurs. And there's lots of content available online. I'm a big fan of theories of change, so I could speak about it the whole hour, but I won't do that to you. So I highly recommend that early stage entrepreneurs consider looking into developing a theory of change, because that's another great way of actually including your stakeholders into your design, and that can actually unlock a lot of innovation. That process of actually developing the theory of change can unlock a lot of innovation. So going back to the KCIC SWIFT program, we developed the theory of change, we identified assumptions and risks. And I want to actually bring up my next slide, which will show you the different steps that we followed with them. We identified the research question, and then we started working on the indicators, right? And I think this is something I want to just pause on for a moment, because this was some of the great ways that IKEA Foundation's M&E team, basically Nick, has been helping us, is to think about, okay, how do we expand this research to really understanding what changes are being made. So typically, if you're working with accelerator and incubator programs, the 3 most popular indicators that I've at least seen from the literature is you look at the companies that have gone through the program, and you see for growth of jobs, growth of the ability to raise funding, and then of course growth of revenues. But what IKEA Foundation pushed us to think about is that, okay, when you think about jobs, are these decent jobs? Let's move the needle, right, to measure more. So what we've included in our research study is actually also understanding, are these fair wages? Is there a sexual harassment policy, especially because there are so many women in the informal sector in waste management? Are the other stakeholders, other groups of people wearing PPE when they're handling waste? Is there a health code for the company? And over the time that they spend with KCIC, are they developing some of these best practices, right? So that's an example of how we are trying to push the envelope on the research. Then, of course, we went into design and methods. Here, as I mentioned, there's a quasi-experimental study. Our goal is to have both a treatment and a comparison group. So we've been co-developing, okay, what are those incentives to actually get companies to complete our surveys, right? Because that's the data collection tool we're using. And so in this process, what we identified is what should be the roles and responsibilities and how KCIC needs to actually lead on the communications, because they are the best place to talk to the entrepreneurs themselves. And then, of course, with analysis, what we have so far in the plan is that we have a propensity score matching, so we can compare the treatment and the comparison group, make sure that they're matched, and then we plan on doing effect sizes. This is all, of course, dependent on our sample size. So check back with me in a year to see if all this has, if all comes to fruition, and then, of course, applying insights. So I just wanted to, in the slides you'll see the visual framework that I typically use for a theory of change. That's what the slide is on right now. And then I want to hand it over to Jonathan and just kind of highlight that there is a lot of power balances that you have to manage, not only within your stakeholder groups, but with your funders, with your implementation partner, with your M&E partner. So I wanted to highlight that. And it's really through the process of collaboration, co-creation, conversation that you can actually really unlock that kind of innovation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jonathan.
Thanks, Akua, and thanks, Stephen and Nick, for really interesting beginnings. I greet you from chilly Johannesburg, where winter arrived last night. So we've had a lovely warm autumn, but I'm freezing cold now. So I'm in Johannesburg. I'm South African born and bred, which makes me African and therefore possibly colonized. But as you can see from my face, I'm this older white male. So maybe I'm the colonizer as well. And perhaps that puts me in a good position to try and look at both of those perspectives. And coming from South Africa, with our work headquartered in Nairobi, in Kenya, and around the continent, that also is an interesting situation. By profession, I'm a psychologist, but I've been in management education since 1990. And in graduate management education, of course, there's a teaching role and a research role and engagement in practice role. So I guess that also makes me, puts me on both sides of the research side. I have been a researcher, and I'm now currently the recipient, if you like, of other people's research excellence. And we started AMI just over 10 years ago, when I had been chair of the Association of African Business Schools. So again, I've looked at business around the continent, and comparing it with business and business schools in other continents as well, which has provided an interesting context. So that's where we reach. I updated the slide and realized that I'd gone backwards in some aspects. We're now more than 100 staff, and 9 countries is right, but 2 of them are now become formal offices. That's Nigeria and Ethiopia. The project we're looking at the moment in this webinar is actually in Kenya, and our impact has been great. And as you all know, it's very hard to nail down impact when we are dealing with many different projects, many different places, different currencies, dealing with COVID lockdowns and all those kinds of things. So that's probably quite an optimistic view of our impact. It varies, as I shall probably talk more about later as well. So we, as AMI, are probably a BDS provider, you could say, business development support provider. And if we go on to the next slide, that describes the project that I want to talk about. It is a randomized control trial. Now, that in itself, of course, as Yakuta, I think, has indicated, comes towards the end. And in fact, Nick, it's rather like your stage gates, in fact, that I think the randomized controlled trials should be offered when you know the answer but want to confirm it. So I use a cycle rather than a extension, what's called a graph, but it's the same kind of idea that you start with not knowing what you know and exploring open-ended research, talking to people, examining your heart, so to speak, and gradually come up with an idea, look at the literature, draw on the literature, find the hole in the literature, the question gets refined, and then you gather data to help fill the hole, and eventually you think you've filled the hole and you do an RCT to confirm it. And that's with a strong counterfactual, Yakuta referring to the control groups, so you can really be sure that it's the treatment that's making the impact. But to do an RCT honorably means it's got to be done by someone outside of your organization. If you do it yourself, you're biased. And all M&E people will know how very, very difficult it is to be objective in dealing with your own data. So we have the RCT being run by two professors from MIT. I'll come to them in a moment. But we needed a sample of 1,400 firms in 2 treatment and 1 control groups. And that's a large number of small businesses to get in and around Nairobi. And in fact, that's proving to be not enough because of the variety in that group that we found. So we might have to extend that, which is very bad news. It's been going on for ages, for at least 3 years, going on maybe 4 years now, that we've been working on this project. What we are evaluating is one of our programs. It's called Grow Your Business. And that program lasts 6 months. The research itself is over 18 months to be able to look at the sort of ongoing effects of the learning. There's a baseline, not every month, but a reduced number of monthly surveys and then an endline survey. And who's doing this? We've been very fortunate to be funded, have the research funded by Argidius and other funders who have been wonderfully, wonderfully patient, particularly as we went through COVID and had to delay the start for quite some time. The researchers are Professor John van Reenen and Tavneet Suri from MIT, which is something of a mecca for randomized controlled trials in developmental economics. So we were lucky to get them, particularly as John is one of the original authors of a paper which started the whole work around practices in business, which I'll get to. And even more so in that Tavneet is a Kenyan. And so has done all the work in Kenya and understands the locality of what we're doing there very, very well. The actual on-the-ground work is done by IPA in Kenya. So these are obviously Kenyan people doing the data collection, and then there's ourselves who are doing the training. And for a good RCT, you want the training and the research to be entirely separate. The results we don't have yet because they're still gathering the data. It's been a very long wait. It's going to be another year or 2 before we get the provisional results. I did put in the note there that we have an M&E team, but I'm being keen and have tried all along to push them towards being R&D as well. So monitoring and evaluation and research and development. And Yakuta, I really go with all you were saying there about how research can be helpful for companies. And in our case, M&E has a kind of an auditing flavor to it. And that's important, but I think it's even more important that we regard our M&E function as helping us to grow in what we do and improve what we do. So it's a continuous improvement function within our company. So and not only that, but we started on a research-based approach through adult learning, and then discovered through John van Reenen and his colleagues' work. They work on practices and the high correlation between implementing practices in your organization and bottom line growth. And that's the innovation that we are particularly interested in. It's a different approach to training. The research on training and entrepreneurship is pretty discouraging, to be honest. More recent meta-analyses has helped a bit, found maybe about a 10% effect of training on bottom line. But we want to do much better. So I could tell you in more detail, if you like, why we think that focusing on practices is so much more effective than training in individual competencies. But that's basically what we wanted to confirm. Our data suggests it's working, but we needed independent confirmation. So we also want our continuing work to be evidence-based. So learning good methodology in our M&E function is also critical for us and a result of the project. So if we go on to what I should have said also is that the participants in this, just as background, they're small businesses. They need at least 3 full-time equivalent staff, more than $10,000 per annum. In one of the last 2 years, we put that in because of the COVID effect. They need to be in operation for at least a year, and the founder should be present in the company and in the program, and they should be willing to share data. Those last 2 requirements they've signed up for and then kind of backtracked on, and we've had some trouble with the sample because of that. So what are the lessons? I'll cover this slide and then pause, and you can take us back for a while, and then we'll go into the second set of lessons. Firstly, research questions need substantial conversation. We are fortunate in having a big overlap between our interests and the research interests, but that's not always going to be the case when you're using external researchers. So we're interested in validating our learning approach. Start at the bottom, it's focused on firm level practices, as I said, more effective than training in individual competence. And the researchers are interested in that, but they're really interested in extending knowledge and in publication. We're also interested in extending knowledge. So there's overlap there, but we are far more interested in the sort of on the ground, is it working? Is our work working? Then maybe they would be. So, but we came up with a good set of questions, and they were very helpful in sharing the questionnaires, and we could discuss those. Randomized controlled trials are useful to confirm what we think we know. I've said that before, and I think maybe we got into this a bit too soon. We thought we were ready for an RCT. We knew what we were doing. But then all sorts of interesting things came up, partly maybe COVID-related, lockdown-related, but also as the sample emerged, there were subtypes, subsamples, if you like, in it, which raised interesting questions and feedback on our methodology, which we should have had before. Well, did have maybe other ones, but we could have used some more exploratory research for longer. And the thing is, with an RCT, it is so expensive, both in money and in time and in attention, that you don't want to waste it, in a sense, by jumping into it before you are quite sure you know what you want to confirm. So we are, but I think we could have delayed another year or so with some advantage. There's been surprise expressed that a for-profit social enterprise like AMI should invest in research. I wasn't expecting that surprise, but people said, well, that's interesting. You know, what government funds you? And it's almost as if research is seen to go along with grants, which clearly it does, particularly when they're expensive like RCTs. But I think it is in the interests of even for-profit companies to invest in knowledge gathering for the reasons that Yakuta outlined, and in general as a contribution to the field. We see ourselves as a social enterprise, although we are for profit, and so we want to, if you like, change the rules of the sector that we're in. And so it's obvious that we should be gathering data. But I was really interested that was unexpected, and maybe there's some kind of evangelism needed with companies to promote the value of research. Then I note that it was difficult to find the sample because we couldn't use our existing programs because you need a control group. And the essence of a control group is the participants don't know whether they're going to be in the experimental group or the control group until they've signed up. Because once the randomization is done, there's no going back. They're in the sample whether they participate or not. Of course, we promised the control group training at the end of the year, but that's quite a big ask. So it was difficult, and the increasing variability that came from this meant we lost statistical power, as I said earlier, and we therefore maybe need to get a bigger sample. And there was a high drop-off rate too, and we're trying to investigate why that is. And I think it's partly to do with the economy where it's been in Kenya, but partly to do with the demands of having to answer the surveys. And maybe some firms weren't as committed as we thought they were at the selection stage. Selecting the firms is really important. They've really got to be willing to be investigated, and I would warmly suggest that you have some sort of performance test, almost a kind of prove that they want to be involved in something like this before you get formally into the research itself. And then finally, we're finding to our horror that our internal data on the RCT sample seems to be less impressive than our internal data on other projects. Why on earth that should be is utterly puzzling. But I think it has to do with the comments I made under the previous point that the sample, it's a free course, so they thought, you know, some of the participants thought, okay, let's just go along and see what happens, and you know, not too committed. They are probably smaller firms than we would like them to be, because we needed to get those 1,400 of them. And it's dragged on a bit. And of course, the control group needs to stay in the sample until they get their training from us at the end of the year. So maybe those firms are actually less committed and less impactful than our other firms in our other programs. Now, it's not a disaster. And we have no idea what the researchers are going to find in their surveys. This is just our internal data, but it's really made us sit up and think. And it goes back to the point that if you want to use research to grow your own insight, go through the cycles of exploratory research pretty carefully until you really have a clear idea of what the RCT is going to find, and then you can check it out. Of course, the RCT will add lots of more data as well, but it's really a confirmatory approach. So let me pause there, Yakuta, and hand back to you. And I've got some thoughts on decolonization of research in my second slide.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you to everyone. So in the interest of time, I'm going to try to find a few efficiencies. We have a couple of questions on how are we incentivizing companies to actually complete our surveys, right? So in our case, for example, it's an electronic survey. KCIC emails the company, and ours is a quasi-experimental design. So the companies in the comparison group know that they are not in the program. So I just wanted to share a couple of thoughts on that, and then let's move on to the next question in the interest of time. But we're still in the process of co-developing incentives, and we're working very closely with actually KCIC's communication team. So in addition to the program team, which is led by a different individual from Stephen, the M&E team, which is led by Stephen, and then the communication team, which is led by another person. So we're working with all three teams and KCIC's communication expert to identify, okay, what are the best incentives and how do we share them? In fact, this is one of the conversations I had with Jonathan earlier on is that to understand, okay, Jonathan, what are you guys doing to develop warm relationships with your companies, right? And so one of the things that Jonathan recommended was they do a monthly newsletter. So we are considering, okay, we don't have resources for a monthly newsletter, but can we at least do a quarterly newsletter that's sent to everyone in the treatment and comparison group? Can we create a benchmark report based on the baseline data that's only sent to the companies in the treatment and comparison group as a way to say, thank you. Yeah, this is the data you gave us, and now we want to actually aggregate it and give back to you, right? So we're thinking of those types of ideas in finding ways to develop a warm relationship. And when we do ask for inline data, and in our case, we're considering 2 inlines, so inline in after about 12 months and another inline in about 24 months to kind of understand change over a longer period of time. How do we actually get these companies to want to share their data with us? So with that, I want to switch to our next round. So let's talk about how we're working to decolonize our research. So what does this even mean? I want to quickly share an academic definition because we are an academic research institute. Decolonizing evaluation has been referred to as the restructuring of power relations in the global construction of evaluation knowledge production such that people may actively participate in the construction of what is evaluated, when it is evaluated, by whom, and with what methodologies. So that's in a paper by Chalisa and all in 2016. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Jonathan, then to Stephen, and we'll close out with Nick.
Thank you. So if we go on to the next slide, and I'll be a bit briefer here, I think. It's been, in terms of collaboration, we found it very helpful to work with the researchers because they are aware of results of research being done around the world that's similar to situations we face. So that's been very helpful. So just the exposure to literature is helpful. And that is something that I'd like to suggest. We need in the sector maybe a kind of a wiki or something that would help practitioners to be aware of what's happening in the research field, and maybe for the researcher to be aware of the questions that practitioners are raising. And Nick, I know that's something that the foundation would be interested in. It's some area, for example, Mackenzie and Woodruff have published very helpful literature reviews from time to time that do, in a quite accessible way, sums up the research. Because most research is not that accessible. I tried attending a PhD seminar for economists a year ago. I'm a psychologist, not an economist, and I can tell you it wasn't that accessible. So we need, the translation of research findings to practice. It was helpful for us also to be exposed to different research methods, which we learned from. It was very helpful to have patient as well-informed funders. And the funders, in fact, helped to link us to the researchers in the first instance. So that was good. It's been very helpful to us that the researchers are leaders in the field, and they also know the funding agencies, but they also have in-field experience. In particular, Tavneet does. Now, that helps with the kind of north-south issue, in that Tavneet spans that divide, and that's been invaluable. We haven't had to try to explain to the researchers what it's like to do business in Kenya. She knows. Then it requires regular meetings between the research parties, so ourselves, IPA, the on the ground researchers, and the principal investigators who are in Boston. Now, what that of course leaves out is the actual participants. To your point earlier on, Yakuta, and that's partly, at least partly, a consequence of the research design, in that when you are doing a randomized controlled trial, and you have a control group, an experimental group, they need to be treated exactly equally, and you plan the thing in advance as a kind of comparison of the treatment to no treatment, and therefore to take the participants into account in redesigning what we're doing isn't going to work. that has to happen in the earlier phases of research, in participatory research, which is another argument for having more participatory approaches earlier on than to be confirmed. It was very helpful just for to have me in particular to come to Nairobi and meet our staff in person. It's much easier than doing emails and even in Zoom meetings. It helped the researchers that we are open to investigation. That turns out to be quite rare too. I hadn't realized that most companies, most organizations, particularly grant-receiving organizations, are quite suspicious of anyone coming and digging into their results and trying to expose what's happening for understandable reasons. And it helped that I have research experience, so I could interpret to my colleagues in AMI what's going on and explain for the 23rd time what a randomized controlled trial is and why no, we can't do whatever it is that we wanted to do. It does help to have some research experience in the company. But I want to go on from that and look at the power dynamics. There's north-south, which is a clear one. It comes out in the form of experience, of the journals are published in the north mostly, and so the questions that researchers want to answer to get published in the best journals originate from the north, which with the best will in the world often doesn't know what's happening on the ground in the south. Life experience is different, resources are different. I was chatting to my wife about this at breakfast this morning. She's a pediatric oncologist. Before she retired from the university post, was involved in research projects in medicine, and said one of the challenges was that the colleagues from the north had wonderful resources of people and were interested in all sorts of interesting little bits and pieces, and expected us in the south here to have the same kind of breadth of resource in terms of equipment and people and assistance and all the rest of it, and we just don't have that. So we have to be, in many respects, more creative in our research methodology, which can be an advantage at times, in fact. Then the difference between researcher and practitioner, I referred to that. We have different languages. That needs to be spanned. Demographics of English language is a factor in terms of kind of power in relationships, educational level, gender, networks, who you exposed to, who you can draw on. And that's an advantage of collaborating research. You get exposed to new networks that you might not otherwise get. Then just a final word on the need for openness. Every seminar we have on funding and on enterprise, entrepreneurship and encouragement and policy and so on talks about the need to share data. It's not going to happen, I don't think, until the incentives are changed to encourage sharing of data. And that's probably a topic of its own, Yakuta. We need to debate and find out how can we change the systemic conditions that will allow for data to be shared. Because we often are competing for funding or competing for evidence. There's competition all over the place, which is not in itself bad, but it can really limit the exposure to what's happening. So yeah, some sort of clearinghouse for data and for information, for insights, for experience, and then a look at the incentive systems that encourage sharing would be, I think, very helpful in making research more democratic in that sense.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. You've touched upon so many key points. So I want to bring in Stephen to say a few words on how KCIC is approaching this very big challenge in evaluation, and then I want to close out with Nick. And Nick, also there is a question for you. So once you share your thoughts on decolonizing research, if you could also talk a little bit about the fourth stage, I believe in your slides about, it's a question by Ulas Marar. Yeah, all right, thank you. Stephen?
Yeah, thank you, Yakuta. And just to add on a few points that Jonathan has mentioned, and for us, what does decolonization of research mean to KCIC? For us, we are looking at how do we put the beneficiaries or our participants at the center of everything that is happening. So it's how do we ensure that their voices are incorporated into the project, and how do we also prioritize their needs and what the particular research is looking at. In a country or in our context, maybe I will give an example. For the last 4 or 5 years, we have seen an influx or a growth in the number of incubators and accelerators that are currently looking at supporting early stage companies or the growth stage companies, who also happen to be the particular target group that we are looking. So when there is no proper way of engaging the clients or the enterprises, you realize there will be so much fatigue in terms of the kind of data they will be answering from each and every incubator or accelerator, because at the end of the day, everyone wants to be able to understand the kind of impact and the kind of benefits that the incubatees are receiving. So for us, we are looking at how do we ensure that the incubatees are also benefiting from this data that we collect. How do we ensure that they do not also get burnouts from the process? Because frequent data collection cycles, frequent requests for data by organizations like us tend to wear down the enterprises. The other particular thing is, especially now that we have a learning partner, that is the WDI, is to ensure that they also are taking into consideration some of the cultural contexts or some of the cultural issues that they may not be aware of, and be able to amplify or incorporate them in all the research components. So WDI has been keen to listen, or also to help us in the structuring of the message that goes out there. Because one of the things that we have noted is when there is uncertainty in the kind of expectations on how we will be meeting some expectations from the clients, then you realize even the participation in the entire research program somehow might get biased. So we are looking, how do we apply the Kenyan entrepreneur lens and ensure that our perception of the reality has been factored in as we develop that. And especially for the SWIFT program, we were lucky or fortunate to bring in a consultant also that is also very good in terms of communication, because at the end of the day, it's about how you communicate, and especially under the RCT model, where you are looking at having that kind of a control group, you need to be very clear in how you communicate. You don't want a communication that is biased. You don't want to have a communication that raises expectations that you will not be able to meet. You don't also have a communication that disengages the entrepreneurs from the word go. So for us, we have had a data-led collection process with the entrepreneurs, involving them even in the structuring of the questions, looking at our past beneficiaries and asking them how that question, or testing the questions that we are formulating, for example, for the surveys, so that at the end of the day, these questions are able to resonate well with the diverse entrepreneurs that we are also looking at. And also frequent communication with the learning partners, so that they are also aware of the progress, because again, this is also time sensitive. We also don't want to miss on any of the milestones that we have already set in place. So having a communication team is critical, because they will be able to look at perspectives that the technical team might take for granted, and also ensuring that whatever we are collecting at the end of the day has the overall perspective of meeting the needs of both the enterprises and also the researchers. I think that's for us some of the key lessons we have learned on this.
Thank you. I think we have 1 or 2 minutes left, Yakuta, right? Yeah. So I'll be very brief. This is obviously a very big challenge for us as a northern-based foundation that funds initiatives, and that comes, of course, from privilege and wealth in its origins. So the two things we really try to do, and I think both Jonathan and Stephen mentioned, and one is just to be a patient and a well-informed funder. So to be on the ground, to talk to partners, to be modest, and to leave lots of room for partners to prioritize. The second one around evaluation, obviously, is to allow partners to find their own evaluation partners and to engage with evaluators that meet their needs and preferences. We don't do it all the time. Sometimes I would commission evaluations, but I would make sure that the bidders or evaluators would come from the global south or have a good footing there. So those are some of the challenges. I think the short answer is give decision-making power to partners and support partners to give lots of input and feedback and participation of their own stakeholders and of their own project participants. I think I should leave it at that.
Great, thank you everyone. To my panelists and of course to the attendees as well for joining. We appreciate your time. We hope you have got some insights, if not many, and I will follow up with emails of the recording as well as the slides. Thank you again, everybody.